Hi everyone, I'm Rebecca Keppel. I'm here for Poppystamps today. Today I have something special. I have 5 ways to use pattern paper on cards and I have a ton of examples. So I'm going to show 5 different ways that I like to use pattern paper on cards because this month over at Poppystamps the challenge is Pattern Paper Please, and I'll have all the information about the challenge listed below in the description. If you do take part, you will have a chance to win a prize, so definitely check that out below. Okay, the first way that I like to use pattern paper on cards is to use strips of pattern paper to create a rainbow. You can do this horizontally, vertically. This time I'm going to do it diagonally. This is a really good way to use up your scraps as well if you keep little bits of pattern paper hanging around. So I am actually using full 6x6 pieces of a Queen & Co. matte stack, which has a rainbow of colors, and I'm cutting strips different widths on that diagonal. Next, I am adhering these strips down with some tape runner to a 4 by 5¼ inch note card. I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to use some non-stick scissors to trim off the excess, just in case there's some adhesive on there, which there definitely was. Next, I'm going to use Poppystamps Large Halo Hello, which cuts that big halo, which I cut out of black cardstock, and then the script hello, which I'm cutting out of silver glitter cardstock. You can see I run that back and forth a few times to make sure it cuts nice and cleanly. Okay, now I'm going to use some Ranger mixed media adhesive behind that thin scripty hello, and I'm going to adhere it to the halo of black cardstock. And a little bit did smush out. That's okay because it dries matte, so you won't see it. I'm going to use some foam tape to pop up this sentiment because I really want it to stand out on that bold background that we created with all those rainbow strips of colors. So I'm just removing the backing of the foam and placing it down in the middle of the card. I'm going to use some tape runner and adhere it down to a 4¼ by 5½ inch top folding white note card. And then I'm going to take some Tonic Studios silver lining Nouveau Crystal drops and just add a few of those. I kept the rest of the card very simple so that that rainbow really stands out. On this version, I did horizontal strips and I used the Happy Birthday Bold from Poppystamps as the sentiment with just a few sequins to embellish. The second way that I like to use pattern paper on cards is to make repetitive die cut shapes like circles or squares. I am using the Pointed Circles Frames die from Poppystamps, and I'm using the smallest circle, which cuts out this frame as well as that interior circle. And the frame is embellished with some dots all around. So I am basically cut this out from 3 different colors of polka dot pattern paper from Fawn. And now I am adhering a strip of a 4th color from the same pattern paper stack, and I'm going to adhere this all together. I'm using some Gina K ink to stamp down the sending from Sending Scribbles, and I'm also going to use some Simon Says Stamp Extreme Black to stamp the sub-sentiment Good Things Your Way. I die cut the sending word because there is a coordinating die for that set, and now I'm popping up the sub-sentiment on some foam adhesive. I'm going to do the same thing with the sending. I just need to cut some little strips to hide behind the major letters and parts of that sending die, and I really like the way that this pops up and looks hanging above that sub-sentiment there. I just had to play with that G a little bit. I didn't want it to cover the sub-sentiment. Now I'm using some Nouveau Crystal drops just to add a little bit of embellishment and some dimension and shine around here. So you can see this is a really easy card to put together, and you could create multiples of this very simply as well. You can see I made another one here where I used a different sentiment and some sequins instead of drops. Another simple way to use pattern paper on cards is to stamp over it and then die cut that out. So I am using Poppystamps Peony Stems and Blossom stamp set, which has these 3 big flowers. I'm stamping with VersaFine Black Onyx ink, which is a pigment ink. And I think for this technique, it is kind of important to use an ink like this because you really want to see the image that you're stamping. And if you have a busy background or even a delicate one like these dots, it's nice to have a nice crisp black image. I'm using some Thermoweb purple tape to hold down the die and run it through my die cut machine. And now I'm using some tape runner to adhere these flowers down. Just with the tape runner that I use, the Memory Runner XL, you do have a few seconds to maneuver things around. As you can see, I do that a couple of times there. Now I'm using a sentiment from that same Peony Stems and Blossoms stamp set. And I am also using the same ink, the VersaFine Black Onyx ink, just so that it all matches. And I've grabbed some Tonic Studios Nouveau Crystal Drops in black to add a few dots around those stems. I really like the way that you see the stamped image, but you also see that pattern paper behind it. I'm going to put a strip of diagonal black and gray pattern paper just to accent that left-hand side there. And all of this goes over a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch top folding note card. You can see in this other example, I used striped pattern paper instead of dots, and it looks just as pretty. So check out your pattern papers and see if you can stamp over them for a new design. The fourth technique is to layer and embellish with your pattern paper. You could do this by cutting out pieces or punching pieces. I love using my dies. So I am going to use the Poppystamps double stitch square frames dies, and I'm going to use every size and cut them out of different pattern papers. These are from My Favorite Things. I have 3 different colors cut, and I'm also going to use the Poppystamps big star border to cut out some little stars to embellish. So I'm going to layer up a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch piece of pattern paper over my card, and then I'm going to layer all of these frames one inside the other to create another look. I'm going to adhere this down to a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch top folding note card. I'm going to stamp the Sending from Sending Scribbles stamp set and die cut that out with the coordinating dies. I've also stamped a sub-sentiment that says birthday wishes at the bottom. And now I'm going to start embellishing with my little die cut stars. Some of these I'm going to use tape runner and adhere them down. Anytime that I'm placing a yellow star over a yellow frame, I'm going to pop it up with some foam tape, just a little itty bitty piece of foam tape that I cut with some nonstick scissors off of my roll. This way it still stands out. I feel like you get that dimension, little bit of pop there. I also did pop up the Sending die cut. I'm using some Spectrum Noir shimmer pen to get a little bit of shine to those stars. And now I'm going to use the Tonic Studios Nouveau Crystal Glaze, which adds both shine and a little bit of dimension as well. I'm going to put that all over the stars and also over the Sending die cut. Just really helps to make these stand out and look more like embellishments. You can see in this other example, I made almost the same exact card, but with a more masculine feel simply by choosing different pattern papers. In this final way of using pattern paper on cards, you can use a vellum screen or hide the pattern paper a little bit behind some vellum in order to tone it down. So I have this really pretty Lawn Fawn plaid pattern paper that I love, but it's a little bit too bold for what I want to do on top of the card. So I am going to stamp some flowers on watercolor cardstock using Simon Says Stamp Extreme Black ink. And these flowers are from the Little Kindness stamp set. I'm going to stamp it twice to make sure that the watercolor paper is completely covered by the design. Next, I'm going to color these designs in. You could use traditional watercolors. I am using Polychromos pencils today, and the reason that I use watercolor paper is because it has lots of texture, and so the pencils can really adhere down to that paper. If it was too smooth, you wouldn't be able to layer your colors. Next, I'm going to temporarily adhere the coordinating dies for this stamp set with some Thermoweb purple tape. This is really great crafting tape because it doesn't ruin your project. It has just enough tack to keep the dies in place while it runs through your die cut machine. So now I have my pattern paper with my vellum, and I have all of my flowers and leaves stamped, colored, and die cut. So I'm going to start adhering them to the vellum itself using some tape runner. The reason that I am not adhering the vellum down yet is because I want to hide the adhesive behind these die cuts there. So I'm going to flip it over and then put tons of adhesive behind the flowers and then adhere it to my vellum. And you can just see how pretty the pattern paper looks now that it's kind of toned down by the vellum. So anytime you have a really busy pattern paper that you really want to use but doesn't work with the card, you think about using some vellum here. And the only other thing I would recommend is if you're going to stamp on top of the vellum like I did here is to use StazOn ink. It's a really great ink. It won't smear and it's perfect for stamping on vellum. I'm going to embellish this card with some Tonic Studios Nouveau Jewel drops. You can see that the other example that I created is very similar. I simply colored these flowers with Copic markers. So that's 5 different ways to use pattern paper on your cards. I hope you'll pull out some of your 6x6 pads and think about ways that you can use strips of them to create rainbows or stamp and die cut or create repetitive shapes or layers or hide a 2-bold pattern behind vellum. If you're interested in any of the supplies that I used today, they will all be linked down below, as will information about the Poppystamps challenge to use pattern paper. You can subscribe to my YouTube channel here or check out my blog. I'll have a couple of videos that you might be interested in here as well. I want to thank you so much for stopping by today. Have a wonderful day.